Before you read another word, a young woman who came to work her Tuesday night shift went home that night as the future wife of the most feared man in the city. She didn't plan it, she didn't ask for it, and she almost didn't survive long enough to find out. At exactly 7:42 p.m., the hostess at Colton's Steakhouse on Meridian Street seated a small silver-haired woman at table 9. The woman moved slowly, carefully, the way people move when their body has quietly started to betray them. She wore a dark wool coat despite the warmth of the evening, pearl earrings, and the kind of quiet dignity that doesn't need to announce itself. The reservation was under the name Ferris. The hostess didn't think twice about it. Her name was actually Margaret Ferris, 71 years old, and she came to Colton's every Tuesday at the same time, ordered the same pan-seared halibut with lemon butter, drank 1 glass of white wine, and left a $20 tip regardless of the bill. She had been doing this for 3 years. What the hostess didn't know, what almost nobody in that dining room knew, was that Margaret Ferris was the mother of Ethan Ferris. And Ethan Ferris was not the kind of man whose name you said out loud without looking over your shoulder first. The waitress assigned to table 9 that Tuesday was a 23-year-old named Becca Dolan. Becca had been working at Colton's for 14 months. She knew Margaret Ferris by heart, the halibut, the wine, the way she always asked about Becca's night before she ordered. Margaret was the kind of customer who made a Tuesday feel manageable, the kind of woman who looked at you like you mattered. Becca always took table 9 when she could. She brought Margaret her wine at 7:49 p.m. and asked, like she always did, "The usual tonight, Mrs. Ferris?" Margaret looked up and smiled the way she always did. "You remembered, every time," Becca said. She had no idea those would be the last easy words she'd speak for a very long time. At 8:03 p.m., the front door of Colton's opened. 2 men walked in. They weren't dressed for dinner. They were dressed for something else entirely. Dark jackets, hands in pockets, eyes that moved across the room too fast, too deliberately, the way eyes move when they're looking for a specific person, and they've already decided what to do when they find her. Becca was on her way back from the kitchen, with an order for table 6 when she noticed them. Later, she would not be able to explain exactly why she stopped. She would say only that something in her stomach dropped before her brain had caught up. The way your body sometimes knows things a full 3 seconds before you do. One of the men reached into his jacket. The dining room hadn't registered anything yet. People were still cutting their steaks. A child at table 2 was coloring on a menu. The piano player in the corner was halfway through something slow and unremarkable. Becca looked at Margaret. Margaret had gone completely still. The man raised his arm. And Becca Dolan, a 23-year-old waitress from Dayton, Ohio, who had never held a gun in her life, who had $340 in her checking account, and a cat named Biscuit waiting at home, moved. She didn't think. She didn't calculate. Something in her that was older and faster than thought simply moved her body between the silver-haired woman at table 9 and the man with the gun. She heard 3 things almost simultaneously: a woman screaming, glass breaking, and then the shots. 2 of them fast, one after the other, like punctuation at the end of a sentence she hadn't been allowed to read first. She felt the first one hit her left shoulder and spin her sideways. The second caught her in the side, below her ribs. She grabbed the edge of table 9 on the way down and pulled the tablecloth with her. Wine glass, bread basket, silverware, all of it crashing to the marble floor as she went. The last thing she saw before the ceiling tilted and everything went gray was Margaret Ferris on her knees beside her, pressing both hands against Becca's side, her pearl earrings swinging forward as she leaned down, her voice steady and low and close. "Stay with me, sweetheart. Don't you dare close your eyes." Becca closed her eyes. The call came to Ethan Ferris at 8:07 p.m. He was in the middle of a meeting he didn't want to be in an office on the 14th floor of a building that didn't have his name on it. When his phone lit up with a number he recognized as one of the restaurant's backline contacts, he felt something cold move through him before he'd answered. He answered. He was in the car by 8:09. By the time he arrived at Colton's, the street outside was blocked with police cruisers and 2 ambulances. His driver had to stop half a block away. Ethan Ferris did not wait for the car to stop completely before he opened the door. He was 41 years old. He stood 6'2" and had the kind of face that people found difficult to read, which was intentional. He had spent a great deal of his adult life making sure that no one knew what he was thinking until he had decided what he wanted them to know. He was, by almost every available measure, not a man who lost composure in public. He lost it in the parking lot of Colton's Steakhouse on Meridian Street at 8:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. His mother was standing outside, wrapped in someone's borrowed coat, speaking quietly to a police officer. She was not physically harmed. He could see that from 30 feet away. He crossed the distance between them in about 4 seconds, and she turned at the sound of his footsteps. "I'm all right," she said immediately. She always said that first, no matter what. "Ethan, I'm all right." He put both hands on her face, checked her eyes, her neck, her hands. She let him. She had learned a long time ago to let him do this before she tried to talk to him. "Where are you hurt?" he said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat and fast, the way his words did when something had overridden his control. "I'm not," she said. "Ethan, listen to me. I'm not hurt." He stared at her. His hands were still on her face. "There was a girl," his mother said quietly. "A young woman. She works here. She was our waitress." She paused. "She stepped in front of me." The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 seconds. "Where is she?" he said. "They took her in the first ambulance, St. Maron's." He was back in the car in under a minute. Becca Dolan came out of surgery at 12:31 a.m. She had taken 2 bullets. The first had passed through the muscle of her left shoulder without hitting bone. Painful, serious, but clean. The second was the one that mattered. It had fractured the 8th rib and nicked a blood vessel on the way through. The surgical team at St. Maron's spent 2 hours and 40 minutes fixing the damage. The attending surgeon would later describe the situation as close. He would not elaborate further, which was, in its own way, elaboration enough. Ethan Ferris was in the waiting room when they brought her out of recovery. He had been there for 4 hours. He had not sat down. His lieutenant, a quiet, careful man named Doyle, who had been with him for 9 years, stood at a respectful distance and said nothing unless spoken to. He had learned, over 9 years, to read the specific quality of Ethan's silence. The silence that currently occupied the waiting room on the 3rd floor of St. Maron's was not one he had encountered before. At 12:47 a.m., a nurse came to tell Ethan that the patient was stable and resting. "She hasn't woken up yet," Ethan said. "It wasn't a question. She's sedated," the nurse said carefully. "She'll likely be conscious by morning." "I'll wait," he said. The nurse looked at him for a moment, at the suit, at the stillness, at the 2 large men stationed quietly near the elevator, and decided not to point out that visiting hours had ended 6 hours ago. She woke at 6:18 a.m. Becca Dolan's first conscious experience of that morning was the awareness of a very uncomfortable tube, followed immediately by a dull, deep, insistent pain in her left side that informed her she was alive. This was, she would think later, an unexpectedly comforting thing to be informed of. Her second conscious experience was the realization that there was a man sitting in the chair beside her bed. She did not recognize him at first. The room was dim, early morning light, curtain half drawn. He was sitting very straight in the chair with his elbows on his knees, and his hands loosely laced together, looking at the floor. He had loosened his tie. He looked, she would think later, like a man who had been holding himself very tightly for a very long time, and had only recently realized he could stop. She tried to say something. What came out was approximately the sound a person makes when they have a tube in their throat and haven't had water in 8 hours. The man looked up. She still didn't know who he was. She would not know, for another 47 seconds, that the man sitting in the chair beside her hospital bed was Ethan Ferris. She would not know, for another 3 minutes after that, what that name meant. She would not know, for considerably longer than that, what it would come to mean to her specifically. What she knew in that first dim morning moment was that whoever he was, he looked at her like she had done something that had broken something in him that he hadn't known could break. "You're awake," he said. She managed a sound that was meant to be yes. He leaned forward. "Don't try to talk. You had surgery. You're at St. Maron's." He paused. "My name is Ethan Ferris. That woman at the restaurant, the woman she's my mother." Becca blinked at him. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up at her. "I've been here all night," he said. I needed to. I needed to see that you were all right." She searched his face. There was something in it she didn't have a word for yet. She would spend a great deal of time over the following weeks trying to find the word for what was on Ethan Ferris's face at 6:18 in the morning in room 307 of St. Maron's Medical Center, and the closest she would ever get was this. It was the face of a man who had just understood, for the first time, what it felt like to owe someone a debt he had no framework for repaying. Margaret Ferris arrived at the hospital at 9 o'clock that morning, with a thermos of Earl Grey tea and the particular energy of a woman on a mission. She had known, from the moment she'd pressed her hands against that young woman's side in the wreckage of Table 9, that things were going to be different now. Margaret Ferris had lived 71 years and had learned to recognize turning points when she saw them. Most people couldn't. Most people looked at a turning point and saw an inconvenience or a coincidence or a tragedy. Margaret looked at this one and saw something else entirely. She sat beside Becca's bed and poured tea into the thermos cap and talked, because Becca's throat was still too raw for much conversation, and Margaret had enough conversation for both of them. She talked about the halibut at Colton's, and how she'd been going there every Tuesday for 3 years, and how the previous waitress had been perfectly nice, but had never once remembered her order. She talked about her son, carefully, not everything, just the outline of him, the edges, and she watched Becca's face while she did. Becca was listening to all of it. She was also, despite the painkillers, clearly thinking. "You're wondering," Margaret said, "why someone would want to hurt a 71-year-old woman who just wanted the halibut." Becca's eyes moved to her. "You'll get answers to that," Margaret said calmly. "Ethan will make sure of it. He's very thorough." She sipped her tea. "What I want to know is what made you move, in that moment, before you had time to think." A long pause. Becca's voice, when it came, was rougher than her normal voice and quieter. "You reminded me of my grandmother," she said. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she set down her tea. "Well," she said softly, "then I suppose I owe her a great debt as well." Ethan Ferris spent the next 72 hours in a state that the people who worked for him found deeply unsettling, not because he was volatile. He was never volatile, but because he was different in a way they couldn't name. He moved through the necessary work. The men who had walked into Colton's were found within 18 hours, the individual who had contracted the job within 36. These matters were handled with the efficiency and finality that the people around him had come to expect. But between those matters, he went back to St. Maron's. He went at odd hours. He didn't stay long the first few times. He stood at the door or sat in the chair and said very little. He brought things, real things, practical things, because Ethan Ferris expressed himself in the practical. He brought a better pillow, because the hospital ones were flat, and she'd been favoring her shoulder in a way that would cause her neck to ache. He brought the specific kind of ginger tea that his mother told him Becca had mentioned, offhandedly, that she liked. He had someone source a particular novel that he'd seen on the nightstand when she was first moved to a private room. The cover was bent back like she'd been reading it before, and replaced it with a clean copy in hardcover. He didn't explain any of these things. He just brought them. Becca watched him do this with the careful attention of a person who has learned not to trust sudden kindness too quickly, but who is also, despite herself, starting to believe in it. On the 4th day, she was sitting up. Her color was better. The tube was gone. She looked less like someone who had almost died, and more like someone who was running out of patience with the process of recovering from almost dying, which Ethan recognized as a very good sign. He sat in the chair, and they talked for the first time, actually talked, not just the logistics of the medical situation, or the polite reassurances of someone who had just come out of surgery. "You could have moved away from me," he said at one point. He hadn't planned to say it. It had been in him for 4 days, and it came out without announcement. In the restaurant, when it started. "You were far enough from the table. You could have gotten down, gotten back. You didn't have to." "I know," she said. "Then why?" She was quiet for a moment. She had thought about this too. She had had 4 days and considerable amounts of morphine, and a great deal of ceiling to stare at, and she had thought about it. "She was alone," Becca said finally. "She was just sitting there by herself, and she was She was old and she was alone and nobody was moving an eye. She stopped. I don't know how to explain it better than that. She was alone. Ethan looked at her for a long time. My father died when I was 7, he said. Something in his voice had shifted in a way that she suspected very few people ever heard. She's been alone for a long time. I know, Becca said. I could tell. He nodded slowly, looking at the window. After a while he said, You're going to need somewhere to stay when you're discharged. Your apartment. He paused. Becca frowned. What about my apartment? It's not safe, he said. Not apologetically, just as a fact. She stared at him. What does that mean? It means, he said carefully, that you are now associated with my family. And the kind of people who sent those men into Colton's on Tuesday night are not going to consider the matter closed, simply because those men are no longer available to be questioned. He looked at her steadily. They're going to consider you a loose end. The room was very quiet. That's not great, Becca said. No, he agreed. So what are you? What does that mean, exactly? What happens now? He was quiet for a moment, then he said simply, You'll come to the house. You'll be safe there. When everything is settled, when I've made certain there's no remaining threat, we'll figure out whatever you want to do next. But right now, you'll be safe. It should have sounded like a command. The way he said it, it didn't. It sounded like the only promise he knew how to make. Becca looked at him for a long time. And if I say no, then I'll arrange protection at whatever location you choose, he said. But I'll lose sleep over it. She blinked. He looked faintly surprised at himself, like that last sentence had arrived without his permission. Okay, she said. Okay, you'll come to the house? Okay, I'll come to the house. She stayed for 2 weeks initially. The house was nothing like she'd imagined. She'd had, she realized, a vague, movie-informed image of something cold and marble-floored and draped in shadow. Instead, it was large and warm and older than it looked from the outside, full of books and an inexplicable number of houseplants, and a kitchen that smelled permanently of whatever Margaret had been cooking most recently. Margaret was there every day. She taught Becca gin rummy and fed her constantly and talked about everything, except the things that probably should have been talked about, which, Becca was beginning to understand, was a Ferris family trait. Ethan came home every evening. He was quieter in the house than he was anywhere else she'd seen him. He shed the outer layer of whatever he wore in the world outside, and became, not soft exactly, but present. He ate dinner at the table and asked real questions, and listened to the answers, which was rarer than it should have been, and Becca noticed it. On the 9th night, they were in the kitchen late. Everyone else had gone to bed. He was at the counter, and she was at the table with her Earl Grey and the hardcover novel and her shoulder in a sling, and they talked for 3 hours without noticing the time. He told her about his father. She told him about Dayton, about her grandmother, about why she'd ended up waitressing in a city she hadn't planned to stay in this long. He told her about the weight of the thing he'd inherited, and how some nights it sat on him differently than others. She told him she understood weight. She did not say she understood his specifically. He appreciated the distinction. At some point past 1 in the morning, she noticed that he was looking at her, the way he'd looked at her that first morning in the hospital. That unguarded, searching look that he probably didn't know she'd clocked, and she said, carefully, You don't have to figure out what to do with me, you know. I'm not a problem you have to solve. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said, you're not. Another pause. You're something else entirely, he said, and then, as if he'd decided something, I think you know that. She looked at him steadily. I'm starting to. On the 14th day, Margaret Ferris sat down across from her son at the breakfast table and said, without preamble, She's going to leave if you don't say something. Ethan set down his coffee. I'm saying this, his mother continued calmly, as someone who has watched you spend 2 weeks, finding increasingly creative reasons to be in whatever room she happens to be in, while simultaneously doing absolutely nothing about it. I'm not. You reorganized the bookshelf in the study, his mother said. You don't reorganize bookshelves. You've never once in your life reorganized a bookshelf. Silence. She's good, Margaret said more quietly, and she's brave in the way that matters. Not the showy kind, the real kind, the kind that moved without thinking because it was right. She looked at her son. I'd like to keep her around, Ethan. I think you would too. He looked out the window for a long moment. She nearly died, he said. Because of our name. Because of what I am. Yes, his mother said without softening it. That's not. He stopped. It's not nothing, his mother agreed. It never will be. But she knows what you are, and she's still here. And she came for breakfast this morning, and laughed at your terrible coffee, and asked if she could water the plants on the east porch. Margaret picked up her own cup. That's not a woman who's waiting for the threat to clear so she can leave. Ethan Ferris was quiet for a very long time. Then he stood up. He found Becca on the east porch with the watering can, just as his mother had said. She was in a sweater that was slightly too big for her, and had her hair up and was talking quietly to the climbing vine on the trellis in the way that people do when they think no one is listening. She looked up when she heard him come out. Your mother said these need watering every 3 days, she said. I think this one's been forgotten. Look at it. He looked at the vine. Then he looked at her. I have to tell you something, he said. She set down the watering can slowly and turned to face him, the morning light coming sideways across the porch. She waited. I think, he said. And Ethan Ferris, who had spent 2 decades saying exactly what he meant to say and no more and no less, chose his words carefully now. That from the moment I walked into that waiting room and they told me you were in surgery, something in me decided without my permission that I was not going to let you disappear from my life. He paused. I recognize that's not. I know what my life is. I know what it costs the people in it. I'm not asking you to make a decision about that. I'm asking you to, Ethan, she said. He stopped. I watered your plants on the east porch, she said. I rearranged your kitchen spice rack 3 days ago because it made no sense alphabetically. I've been here for 2 weeks. She held his gaze. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, she said. He reached out and carefully, deliberately, like a man who had decided to stop pretending he didn't want to. He took her hand, the one that wasn't in a sling. He held it loosely, the way you hold something you're not planning to let go of. The vine on the trellis, had she noticed, started to come back, just a little. With enough water and enough time, things had a way of doing that. 3 months later, Margaret Ferris had dinner with her sons and Becca Dolan at Colton's Steakhouse on Meridian Street. Table 9. The halibut, 1 glass of white wine. Becca ordered it too as a joke, and then found to her surprise that she actually loved it. Margaret told the new waitress to write it down. She'll be ordering that for a long time, she said. The new waitress smiled and wrote it down and didn't think twice about it. Ethan looked at Becca across the table, in the same room where everything had started, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. They didn't need to. If you've ever had someone step in front of danger for you, or if you've ever been the kind of person who can't explain why you moved before your brain gave the order, then you already know what that silence felt like. Drop a comment below and tell us, would you have done what Becca did? And if you haven't already, hit that like button for Mia's Romance Library, because there are a lot more stories coming. A lot more Tuesdays at Table 9 that end up changing everything.